Okay, I sort of had a plan on what I was going to do, and then they operated on me this morning, and then I was a little fuzzy-headed. And so I worked on this afternoon, and I may be as surprised as you are as to what comes up. But this is, of course, the Middle East. Anything that you knew about the Middle East, I'd say even 5 years ago, throw it out the window. It has changed completely. Now, some of the names are still sort of the same on the maps, but it is an entirely different place. And this is so clever. This is from a few years ago when something called the Arab Spring started. And anybody that knew at the time what was going on realized how futile that was to call it the Arab Spring. It was like it had all this hope of everything was going to, and it all started with one guy setting himself on fire, and it of course spread all over the Middle East, and even this is not up to date, but of course the biggest fire is still going on up in Syria. Let me give you a quick quiz, and because Palestine and this whole idea of the Palestinians seems to be, always comes back to the core of things. You know, when is Trump going to bring peace between the Palestinians and the Israelis? When is Obama going to do it? When is Bush going to do it? When's Clinton going to do it? Every one of those presidents, and I hope it's not Trump, is attempting to reach for this golden ring as they go around on the merry-go-round, and they have wasted so many millions and so much time and effort on something that, frankly, maybe this will expose it a little bit. The state of Palestine. When was the state of Palestine founded and by whom? Don't shout out your answers yet. What were its borders? What was its capital? What were its major cities? Name at least one Palestinian leader before Yasser Arafat. What was the language of the people of Palestine? What was the religion of that ancient country? What's the name of its currency? Since there's no country of Palestine today, what caused its demise and when did it occur? If you have an answer to any of these questions, you're going to win the Yasser Arafat Literary Award for creative and imaginative writing. Quite honestly, in many ways, until 1964, there were no Palestinians. Arafat, in many ways, invented it and sold this bill of goods to the world. And by selling it to them, saying there is a unique ethnic group called the Palestinians, and they don't have a homeland, and that's all of the trouble in the Middle East, all revolves around that. And a lot of Middle Eastern leaders picked up on that language, but they didn't raise a hand to do anything for the so-called Palestinians. Look, I won't go into this whole thing, but an ethnic group has certain things that are unique about it. It has its own language, it has its own history, usually its own food, and all those kind of things, none of which, now I'm not saying there aren't any Palestinian people. There are Arabs who came in from all over the world, starting in around the 1880s, into that land as the Jews started coming back. They had no idea. The land was called Palestine, and that goes back way into history, why it was called that. It was never called that in biblical times. You won't find that word in the Bible at all. Pardon me? Well, not yes, well, maybe. Okay. Threw me off my game there. Anyway, the whole idea is that it was invented, and it's recent. And I have a hunch that all of you were alive and kicking in 1964, or maybe your grandmother would tell you about what was going on then. That's when this whole idea of the Palestinians started. And everything seems to revolve around it over and over again. I even heard criticism, it was today, of Trump. When is he going to solve the Palestinian problem? Because that would solve everything. When Schwarzkopf, right after the first Gulf War, suddenly he was the expert on anything, and you asked him the question, what about Middle East peace? The Palestinians need a homeland. Well, it's not true. As a matter of fact, this is another map of the Middle East. On the Saudi-Yemen border, there's fighting going on. ISIS is involved there. Actually, ISIS isn't going to show up in my presentation tonight. Not that it isn't important, but it's a little convoluted. There's intra-Muslim terrorism proliferates all over the Yemen border. After Mubarak came out of Egypt, you could follow the anti-U.S. Turkish or even the Iranian path. The Sudan and the Horn of Africa are saturated with conflicts. Islamization of Turkey's policy fosters regional radicalization. Those are big words, and I can hardly pronounce them myself. But Turkey just had an election last week. They're moving closer and closer to a dictatorship there. And I'll explain a little bit more the importance of that. But they're moving away from looking toward Europe. And but the bottom line is this: none of these are caused by lack of an Israeli-Palestinian accord. And these are just underlying things. I'm not even talking about battles that go on. And I'm going to skip some of this. It's the same kind of things talking about what's going on in the Middle East. Welcome to the real Middle East. The violent developments are not driven even remotely by the Palestinian issue. But I will talk about it because I think it's important that you understand it and clarify it a little bit. Now, we go back to 1917, 100 years ago. Great Britain was the largest empire in the history of the world. And they were at the top of their game. They were fighting in World War I, but they realized that they were probably going to win it. And at that time, for a number of reasons, they said, whoa, we can do something about the Jews who are scattered all over Europe and other places. And when we win the war, and they worked this out with France behind the scenes, they said, we're going to give a national home for the Jewish people in this area that they were calling Palestine. And you can see none of them were on the ground there because they just laid a straight edge down on a map and started drawing straight lines. The Middle East today is really, in many ways, the result of what happened in 1919 when they spent a whole year in Paris redrawing maps of the world. And it had little to do with the breakdown of tribes and everything else. But in 1917, the British said we're going to have a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But by 1921, they changed their mind. They said, no, there's not enough room for the Jews to come. The Arabs need a place, so what they did, they took 77% of the land away. When I was a kid, we used to call that being an Indian giver. If somebody gave you something, they wanted it back. I think it's a British giver is more accurate. And in fact, what they did, because the British had a mandate from the League of Nations at that time to see over this area until the people could grow up, in their words, and run their own country. It was to be a temporary deal. But within 3 years, they already violated the mandate that the League of Nations gave them, and they said 77% no Jews allowed. They can't go across the Jordan River. That thing that looks like a kidney there in the middle, that's the Dead Sea. And that blue line heading north is the Jordan River, and the little dot up there is the Sea of Galilee. So anyway, they decided no Jews allowed across the river. And it's a whole new country that they invented overnight, and Winston Churchill was the State Secretary at that time. And so he's the one that actually bragged. He said, on a sunny afternoon with a pencil and a straight edge, I created Trans-Jordan. Let me talk about the derivation of these words for a minute. Middle East. First time I went there, I was talking to someone and I said, you know, you Middle Easterners, and they said, what is that? I said, Middle East. What does it mean? Well, you have to have a British viewpoint. From the British Empire, as they looked out in those days toward their crown jewel, which was India, midway east was this area of the world. So they called it Middle East, which of course makes no sense to anybody that lives there. But it was a viewpoint. You understand what I'm talking about? A viewpoint from England looking that way. So when they divided this piece of land also from an English viewpoint, which was over here. They looked at the Jordan River and they said, okay, that area is on the other side of Jordan, or Transjordan. So they named it that way. And they administered two states now. One they called Palestine on the left, and the other they called Transjordan. Now that was the first two-state solution almost 100 years ago. I mean, how'd that work out? Anyway, this is kind of the documentation of when all this stuff happened. It was in 1921 at San Remo, which was in France. It was approved by the League of Nations in 1922, and then they divided it up. So that's what they cut off there. And then, to make matters worse, all of you have played King of the Hill, I'm sure. We used to like to do it, get on a dirt pile and, and kick the dirt in the other kid's face. You're king of the hill. Well, that still works militarily. You want the high ground. And so what Britain did next was take the high ground from the new Jewish homeland and give it to France, who immediately turned it over to Syria. So they lost what is called the Golan Heights. And until 1967, this was a terrible thorn in the side of the Jewish nation, because the Syrians set up there with Russian help, and they put all their artillery up there, and whenever they felt like it, they just opened up on the Jewish towns and the Jewish neighborhoods. In 1948, the Brits finally washed their hands of the whole mess, and they said, we're out of here. And on the evening of the 14th of May in 1948, there were 5 Arab armies lined up on the borders just waiting for the last British commissioner to leave so they could rush in. And which they did. Is called Israel's War of Independence. The army that was in Transjordan, which had been built by the British, which was officered entirely by the British, from the British General John Glubb through the British colonels, down through the majors and captains, all British officers, all British weaponry, and most of the soldiers were Arabs. That was called the Arab Legion. It was really a British army. The British army attacked the Jewish state that morning of the 15th of May, 1948. And so they came across the river and they took what has become known as the West Bank. And the Egyptians came up from the south out of the Sinai into the Negev, and they took Gaza, and then up on the Golan Heights, the Syrian army was there. Lebanon attacked, but that didn't work out very well for them. Anyway, so for 19 years, the Jordanians sat on the West Bank, and nobody in the world said a thing about it. In 1967, because the Arab armies hadn't finished the job of driving the Jews into the sea, they all lined up again to attack again. This time with the final solution, we're driving the Jews into the sea. And I've listened to the phone call that Lyndon Johnson made to Levi Eshkol, who was the Prime Minister of Israel. Of course, we knew in 67, the U.S. knew, that all these armies were lined up and it was going to be a massacre. And so Lyndon got on the phone with Levi Eshkol, and in his Texas way of talking, he said, now listen, Levi, you let them shoot first. He saw all these cowboy movies, the bad guy has to draw first and then the good guy can shoot. And he said, you let them hit you first and then we'll help you. And Lyndon hung up the phone and he said, I know damn well they're going to hit him first. And he was right. The 6-day war was really a 6-hour war. Israel flew into Cairo West, where basically the entire Egyptian Air Force was all lined up and spit and polished, ready to go. First they went in and they rocketed the airstrip, and then they went back and took care of all the planes. They did the same thing to the Syrians. Now there were thousands of Egyptian and Syrian tanks in the Sinai and also up in the Golan Heights. But a tank without air cover is just a big piece of iron with a kind of a big gun on it that really can't shoot down planes. So that war, which turned out to be a 6-day war, which, by the way, is, on the Jewish calendar, it's next week. Okay, 50 years. It's 50 years from that battle. I mean, who can believe 50 years has gone that fast, huh? Jerry, we were just children in Vietnam. Must have been unfair to send us there when we were about 8 years old or whatever it was. Anyway, that 6-day war was over so quickly. And what happened was that the Egyptians were driven out of most of Israel, except for the Gaza. Well, they drove that out. The Syrians were driven off of the Golan Heights, and the Jordanians, who'd been sitting there for 19 years, holding the city of Jerusalem and all of the West Bank, they beat feet and they went home across the river. Meanwhile, while they were on the other side of the river, they decided, we're no longer Transjordan. That means across the river. Get rid of the trans. We are Jordan. We are the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan. So that's how they have their present name. Now, what happened was within 6 days, Israel acquired the West Bank. They acquired the Sinai Desert. They got the Golan Heights. All of that happened. Israel had really no intention of getting Jerusalem. They kept sending messages to King Hussein, don't get into this. We're already tied up in the Sinai. We're already tied up in the Golan. And King Hussein opened fire on them. So when they finished the job in the south and the north, then they went and they recaptured the city of Jerusalem. Now, that was 50 years ago, next week, the very day that Trump is going to be in Jerusalem. And I would be prepared for a big announcement, I hope. But it also, I don't want to tell war stories here, but in 1967, when we were in Vietnam, I was an advisor at that time with the Vietnamese Marines. And so when we came out of the field, we had a hotel room. I don't know how many of us shared it, in Saigon, and we get cleaned up and all that stuff. So I went to that hotel room. I went down to get something to eat in the hotel, and some guy says, can I eat with you? He was turned out to be a minister who had just been in Jerusalem. And he sat and he talked to me all that evening about this is the fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And I'm going, wow, it's the first time I'm hearing this stuff, and I'm sort of putting it in the back of my head. And he said, Jesus said that the Gentiles will trodden down Jerusalem until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. This is the first time the Jews are running Jerusalem in over 2,000 years. And look, that stayed in the back of my head, just like little things that have probably been said to you at times. And then they have much fuller meaning. And so anyway, I think it is significant biblically and other ways that Israel, again, has Jerusalem as their capital. However, it is the only capital in the world where we have relations with them, where we do not have our embassy in their capital city. We have refused to move it there. Our embassy is in Tel Aviv. 1995, a law was passed to move that embassy to Jerusalem, with a little out that if the president decides for national reasons he can't do it, he has a little caveat. Everyone that's ever run for president since 95 has promised to move the capital to Jerusalem, and then every 6 months they sign a piece of paper, well, we can't do it. Who knows what it would do to the world? Today's Wall Street Journal has a editorial in it. It said, basically, Russia recognizes Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Why can't we? And of course, Trump's promised to do it, but that's another story. We'll see how that all works out. Okay, this is what is called the occupied West Bank today. It looks like an omelet. It is the mountains of Jerusalem. It is the high ground. And these areas up here where it says Netanya, it's only 9 miles wide. If in fact Israel was ever stupid enough to give this to a new country which would be at war with them from day one, it's only 9 miles wide to the beach. It's only 11 miles wide at Tel Aviv. This is where the bulk of the Israelis live. And you'd give them the mountains? I don't think so. Anyway, that's called the occupied West Bank. These are major wars that Israel has fought. And I would guess this is in our lifetime of most people in this room. These are major wars. We have lost a lot of wars or called it quits before we finished. Israel cannot do that. They have to win every one. Okay, now here's what's really going on, the bigger picture. And I believe the bigger picture in the Middle East right now is the rise of what were great empires. If you spend any time in the Middle East, if you're in Greece and you talk to people out in the countryside, or if any other country in the Middle East, they sometimes are talking to you and you realize they're really talking about 1200 BC when they were at the top of the world. And that, I think, is part of what is going on in the Middle East today. The Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire, all of these the leaders of those countries look to when they were at the top of the ball game. And they dream about this. Saddam Hussein, he was looking the same thing with Iraq. This goes on all the time. And the more you get in depth and talk to these people in these countries, you realize they may be living in the past, but they want to get back to that. And so, as an example, the Persian Empire, one of the great empires of the world, Ahmadinejad was there. I wished, 12 years ago, I didn't even have to learn his name, but he hung around for a long time. And he has been very influential in the world, more so than you can ever imagine. And first it was the Ayatollah Khomeini. Today it's the Ayatollah Khamenei, almost the same name. That is the ultimate decider-in-chief. Nothing happens if he's opposed to it. And it doesn't matter who the president is. The president today is Rouhani. And because Rouhani is better looking than Ahmadinejad, people immediately said, oh, he's a moderate, he's so kind, he smiles, he does all that stuff. I want to tell you who this guy is, and I'll make it very brief. I could really go into his background. But when he was 32 years old, he was the first defense minister of Iran. And as defense minister, they were fighting Saddam in Iraq. And they had a real problem with minefields. They had nobody to clear the minefields. They first started running donkeys and things in there, but they're not that stupid. As soon as one blew up, they turned around and ran out of there. Rouhani came up with this idea of getting children. And telling these children, they send them to school, they did this whole thing, that if you give up your life, immediately you'll be welcomed. Allah will be there welcoming you, and Muhammad's there waiting for you. And he gave them plastic keys. And as long as they could blow themselves up into eternity with that plastic key, they would be met, and willingly they marched children through the minefields, and then the soldiers came after them. This is not a nice man. And he hasn't gotten any nicer over the years just because he's learned how to smile. And we made the most egregious deal in the world with Iran as far as the nuclear weapons go and all that sort of stuff. And we're really dealing with the devil there. There's another empire out there. It was called the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire was Suleiman the Magnificent. And Ataturk, after World War I, he became the leader of the Ottoman Empire. Most of it was severed after World War I, and the only part that remained was Turkey. And Ataturk said the reason Ottoman Empire became so weak and so far behind Europe was we were looking the wrong way, and we were too fundamentalist in our religion. So, copying the United States, he decided there's got to be a separation between state and mosque. And he said to the men, get rid of those fezzes. The only fezzes you find now are on the Masons. What is it? The Shriners. Okay. And but everybody in the Ottoman Empire used to wear them. That was the mark of distinction. And the women were wearing burqas and veils. He said, get rid of the veils, get rid of the burqas. We are going to be a secular country, and we have to look toward Europe because that's where the advances are. So from the time of Ataturk after World War I, Turkey was attempting always to get into NATO and to get into the European market. They certainly have exported millions into Germany as workers. The Turks are there. But now, since Erdogan has come into power, Erdogan has progressively moved, looking back toward the Islamic world, looking back to the east. And he's moving in that direction. And that election last week only gave him more constitutional power, basically to take over the country and to move in that direction, because he sees himself not as the head of Turkey, but as the head of a great empire again. So you've got a couple of empires moving toward each other. One is Persia, today we call it Iran, and the other is Turkey. And there's a third one that has just moved back into the Middle East. For 40 years we kept them out, and that's Russia. And whether it was the former Soviet Union or not, it's still the Russian Empire. And that's Lenin, who of course took over right during World War I, and then Stalin took over for him. And this is their successor, probably more brutal than any of the previous ones. And he certainly took a look at our leadership during the last 8 years, and he said, I can push this guy around. And he went into Crimea, he's moved, and he came into Syria. Syria is such a mess, nobody can really figure it out, but he's in there, and he's back in the Middle East, and we allowed him back in, because in many ways this is a big Game of Thrones between empires. Now there's other, of course, currents that go on, but it is affecting what is going on in the Middle East. So let's look again quickly at Israel and see what's going on in there. There is a terrorist organization in the north. In my opinion, the country of Lebanon doesn't even exist anymore. Lebanon is run by Hezbollah. And Hezbollah, if you see it, a definition of it in the paper, it'll say Party of God. That is a lie. You can read it right there. It is the Party of Allah. And we seem to editorially refuse to say that, oh, Allah and God, it's all the same thing. Dig into it and you'll see it's not the same thing at all. It's the Party of Allah. And so you can see what is the basis of it. It's very much like ISIS, only they haven't gone as far as ISIS. They've taken over Lebanon, and now they're in Syria, and they're fighting on the side of President Assad, massacring. Perhaps 500,000 people have already died in Syria, and we know there's been more than 5 million refugees have come out. Now those refugees coming out are not only impacting the United States, but they certainly are impacting Europe incredibly. Europe will never be the same, because it's not only those people coming out of Syria, it's refugees from other countries jumping in there, throwing passports and stuff away, and moving into Europe. It is changing Europe for good. Hezbollah in the north, that's Nasrallah. He's the head of Hezbollah. That's President Assad, who's getting a smaller and smaller enclave all of the time in Syria, but he doesn't seem to matter. He's going to kill everyone that he possibly can before they finally get him, and that who Putin has aligned with him. Down in the Gaza Strip is another terrorist group called Hamas. The titular head of Hamas just retired last week. I don't know how long he's going to live, but he's worth $1 billion. And that money that goes to Hamas and Hezbollah is coming out of Iran. We just gave them $150 billion as a result of their saying, gee, we won't build a nuclear weapon for 10 years. $150 billion, and believe me, it is funding terrorism all around the world. And that's Mashal, who is one of the richest guys in the world. He's a young man, and he won't live very long, probably.
You're saying the money comes from our pocket.
Well, a lot of it has.
Okay.
You look at the John Kerry deal with Iran, and follow the money trail. I mean, we had airplanes flying in there with... Okay, Fatah is another terrorist organization. That is Abbas, who is supposedly the president of the Palestinian Authority. He was just in the White House meeting with Trump. 8 years ago, his term ran out. He was supposed to have another election. For 8 years, we've pretended he is an elected official. And he's not going to call an election because he knows he can't win it. And so this was Ahmadinejad looking down his nose, about the snarkiest picture I could find of him at that time. Iran is behind much of this. One of the reasons that Iran is so involved in fighting in Syria is because they want a pathway straight to the Mediterranean. They already have a pathway through the Persian Gulf, where a fifth of our oil comes through there, a fifth of the world's oil comes through there every day. Now, this is all Ahmadinejad. He's out of office now, but this is what he was doing during the years he was in. He was in Algeria. Every one of these countries, he was not getting frequent flyer miles. He was making a solid deal with every one of these countries, and it's already been laid out. And so he was in Syria, Indonesia, Sri Lanka, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan. These are also supposed to be our allies, and he's in there making deals with them. This is, they invented chess. And they're usually 2-3 steps ahead of what our thinking has been, certainly in the last years with our State Department. And they're way ahead on this. In Turkey, in Russia, and this is him. This isn't a fake cardboard cutout shaking hands with the leaders there. I hope you get my point. Brazil, well, Venezuela, Chavez is dead, but it doesn't matter. Venezuela is a total disaster area. Bolivia, Nicaragua, and Cuba, and so forth. I'll go through this very quickly. Deals have been made with all of these South American countries, and we never look to South America. It's just like as Americans, it's off our radar screen. But all of these are aligned with Iran, and they're not aligned with them for religious purposes. They're aligned with them for bigger purposes than that. One continual theme runs throughout all of those alliances. Number one, it's hatred of the Jews and its destruction of Israel. One of the first things that Khomeini said in 1979 when he came in and he took over Iran was, the first thing we got to do is get rid of the two devils in this world. The major devil is the United States and the little devil is Israel. And their first step is Israel. You can see running through all these countries where Ahmadinejad had been in there during the last years, hatred of the Jews, destruction of Israel, and hatred of the United States and Christians, because it's Christians that are supportive of Israel for the most part. Khomeini, he said this, in order to achieve the victory of Islam in the world. How can that be? We've all been told it's this religion of peace. The victory of Islam, it is a worldwide effort this is what Islam is all about. And I know I'm probably stepping on toes that said, oh no, we got to learn to, never mind. Okay.
A piece, John, a piece of your head, a piece of your arm, a piece of your legs.
He said this is part of his statement. He said, we need to provoke repeated crises. That's 1979, and we really didn't pay attention. You look at the world today, it is repeated crises, and they seem to be coming faster and faster. And he wants to restore value to the idea of death and martyrdom. That made no sense to us. In 1983, we had a truck pull up in the Beirut airport and roared right in and blew up and killed 241 Marines and Navy personnel. Plus many were injured, many are still injured for life. And I had a little part in investigating that whole thing. We did not believe that this guy did it on purpose. As a matter of fact, we talked to the guard on duty, and he said when that guy drove past me, he had this big smile on his face. We go, aha, he was retarded. They recruited somebody retarded, And he drove in there, and then somebody with a garage door opener from across the road blew up the truck. Well, the same thing happened at our embassy in April in Beirut. The same thing happened to the Israelis in their headquarters in Tyre. And we thought, pretty soon they're going to run out of these retarded drivers. And then it finally dawned on us, these people are true believers. It didn't, prior to that, we didn't really believe that a person would blow himself up to kill infidels. It's true. I mean, now that's just accepted because they make videos before they go out and do it so that the record is there. He said, if Iran has to vanish, he took over Iran. His entire life was dedicated to get rid of the Shah and to take over Iran. And he said, if Iran has to vanish, if it has to blow up, who cares? You think the leader of a nation would be concerned about the fate of his people. He said, if Iran has to vanish, that's not important. The important thing is to engulf the world in crises. He laid it down, and it changed the world ever since that time. And that's a picture of him. And these are followers of people who rushed to him. Arafat rushed there. Major Haddad, Hassan, and Hezbollah. And all these leaders, they rushed there to kiss his ring as soon as they could. And that one person changed the world, certainly changed the Middle East. And he said this, we must all rise, destroy Israel, replace it with the heroic Palestinian nation. He gave that order, and that's been what they've parroted pretty much ever since. I forgot this picture was here. This is right before the Arab Spring. It's Hosni Mubarak, who was the president of Egypt, meeting with President Obama. Obama's first speech as president, first foreign speech, was in Cairo. And he insisted that the Muslim Brotherhood be allowed to attend his speech. Mubarak had outlawed the Muslim Brotherhood. Mubarak did not go to that speech, but there they were in the front row, the Muslim Brotherhood, listening to this special speech that he made.
He was disinvited.
And this was kind of a joke at that time, but Mubarak was kind of not knowing what's going on. He says, hello, Obama, my friend. You can tell me the meaning of game over? It's very much like Jimmy Carter did to the Shah of Iran. The rug was pulled out from under him. Iran, up until that time, had been our linchpin, our major nation in the Middle East that we relied on. As a matter of fact, in those years, Israel got their oil from Iran, from the Shah of Iran. Once the rug was pulled out and Iran changed and Khomeini showed up, then we really switched in many ways to Egypt. Under Sadat, and then when he was assassinated under Mubarak for 40 years, that was our key country there. And Obama pulled the rug out from Mubarak. And what really happened here, this is not necessarily another empire, but it certainly could be an empire, and I call it the Arab League. They call it the Arab League. There's 22 Arab countries, and there's 360 million people in them. That's a big swath. They've never been able to quite get it together. Every time they've attempted war, especially against Israel, their unity lasts for about a half an hour, and then they start fighting with each other. But it says this in the Bible about these sons of Esau, that they're a wild ass of the desert, and their hand is against all of their brothers, and their brothers against them, and they can get it together for a short period of time. This is President al-Sisi. This slide came up wrong. I had some of these leaders. That was Nasser and Sadat, and then Mubarak, and then we helped to usher in the Muslim Brotherhood to take over Egypt. And they were about to change things as much as they could. Hillary helped them out and all of that. And then, horror of horrors, the army stepped up and they threw Morsi out, and al-Sisi got elected. Of course, our former administration did not recognize that, because after it's an army, how can they take over a country? But he is, at first, he was all alone. And under Obama, they wouldn't have anything to do with him. Even the planes that we had already sold to them, we wouldn't deliver them. So he says, okay, boys, I got to go somewhere to get help. So he went to Russia. And but fortunately, we woke up. He's also been at the White House recently. So that's al-Sisi. This is the Muslim Brotherhood. I won't go into the whole background there. Ahmadinejad said this during the Arab Spring. He was trying to get into Egypt. And he said, it's your right to be free. It's your right to exercise your will and sovereignty. Choose the type of government and the rulers. A new Middle East is emerging without the Zionist regime. They can't say the word Israel. There's 22 Arab countries. One thing Netanyahu demands is that Israel be recognized as a Jewish country. 22 countries say we are an Arab country on their flag and everything else, and they refuse to say the words a Jewish nation. So they'll use terms like Zionist regime and U.S. interference. Only militant Islam and the hatred of Israel can unite all of these empires. At least that's what I think. And so consequently, they'll play any card they can in order to go against Israel. You've been through all this before. I don't know how this showed up again. But you can see Ahmadinejad working his magic over and over again. This is what the Bible talks about. There's a time in the future. It's called the War of Gog and Magog. And all of these countries we've been looking at, which are looking for a way to unite, to wipe out Israel. This is one person's idea of how this could come about. One of the things that I think is important, that's a whole new thing in the ball game, is the Jews always tell this story about Israel. And they said, oh, Moses, that Shlemiel, when he led us out of Egypt, boy, what a mistake he made. If he'd turned right, we could have got the oil and the Arabs could have got the sand. But no, he turned left. Because for many, many years, Israel said we have no natural resources. When the Muslim Brotherhood took over and cut the pipelines, Israel was buying oil from Egypt. Suddenly, they discovered two of the largest oil fields and gas fields off the coast. They're amazing that they are so big. As a matter of fact, one of the schemes is that they may just build a big port out there and tankers can fill up right in the ocean they're already bringing it into Israel. Israel is already oil free. I mean, they've got it. And something they never had before. And natural gas. So, what's that have to do with drawing some of these in? Russia gets all of its income from selling natural gas to Europe. Suddenly, there's somebody else on the block that is a competitor. I mean, it's one of the reasons Russia wants to get back into the Middle East. They already came down to Israel and they tried to make a deal when this was first discovered. And thank God there's a Texas oil company involved with Israel, and they said, no way. And then the Chinese came trying to get in on this. So anyway, that's what's going on. That could be the hook that certainly brings Russia back into the big game. This is Netanyahu. I don't think there's another person in the world that has so many critics and so many enemies, even though Gaddafi has left the world. But he's certainly surrounded by all of these people who all have nasty things to say about him. Jimmy Carter, Zbigniew Brzezinski, George Mitchell, Hillary, whatever her name is, John Kerry, you name it. Every one of those are not only critics, but really hate Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel.
What about Jordan?
Jordan?
Yes, Jordan.
Yeah, Jordan called the White House today. King Abdullah. And he was here a few weeks ago, and he was petitioning Trump not to move the embassy to Jerusalem. And there was a phone call today. Of course, I wasn't privy to what it said, but I know it was the same thing, because it certainly looks like next week when Trump goes to Jerusalem, he, I hope, moves the embassy. So Netanyahu, I don't know a world leader that has more people that hate him. Now there's other haters in the world. This is Tim Kaine. This is, what's her name from Massachusetts? Elizabeth Warren. This is Clapper, Bernie Sanders, Nancy somebody, George Soros, Maxine Waters, one of our favorite California congresswomen, Hillary, what's her name? John McCain. You go on, Schumer, Cory Booker, Tom Perez, who's head of the DNC, and they all hate somebody, and he just shakes it off. Okay, this was done just as I got out of the hospital today. I'm not sure how clever it is, but anyway, I put it together. However, there is a new team in town, I think, and it's certainly, I believe, from a biblical standpoint, that nations are judged how they treat Israel and how they treat the Jewish people. And if any of you are interested, I'd be glad to give you Bible verses on it. But we have been going the other way for a long time, at least for 8 years. We are heading the other way where we're really turning our backs on them. And but this is kind of indicative of when Netanyahu was just there. They're up there laughing. They're enjoying each other. And it seems that certainly they're on the same page. That can only bode well for our nation as well. Look, that's Israel, that little red spot there. It's a very small, tiny little country. Turkey to the north. I said Turkey is moving toward the east, attempting to be the Ottoman Empire again. Egypt to the south, Iran out to the east, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Iraq, and Jordan. And Lebanon, I don't think it exists, but the name is up there. That tiny little disputed strip of real estate on planet Earth, that's the most disputed strip of real estate on planet Earth. How big do you think it is? New Jersey. Huh?
Rhode Island.
Yeah. Let me show you something. This is Israel compared to the United States. I know you think half of Lake Michigan slid down to Wichita, Kansas, but it's that small. You may recognize that little red blot there. That's Fresno County. It's 6,000 square miles. Next door is some county named Madera, and we're 2,000 square miles. That's 8,000 square miles, exact size of Israel. Our two counties. Most people go, can't be. They're in the newspaper all the time. They're tiny. Well, certainly from a biblical standpoint, that's the only land that God calls my land. And he calls it that 8 times. He said, I reserve it. I'm not hoggy. I invented all of it. All I want is for this small piece of land. I have plans for it. And so we can fit, I won't bore you with this whole thing, but we can fit about 20 of them into California. So it's a very small country, and yet everything in the Middle East revolves around it. Everything really revolves around Jerusalem. If you think of Jerusalem as the middle of a pond and you throw a rock into it, the ripples will affect all of the world. This is the kind of stuff that's going on college campuses. It started out as Israel Apartheid Day. Then it went to a week. Now it's up to 2 weeks. It'll probably be a month pretty soon. And most college students don't even know what apartheid stands for. They don't remember what it was in South Africa, but they take that term and they put it on this country, which is nothing like that at all. I have really, you people have been great. I don't know how you lasted so long.